Welcome to you all, and of course to our panelists who've taken the time to join us today from all over. I have a bit of bad news on some of the panelists who've had to drop out, but we've still got such a broad selection of participation that I'm sure we'll be able to fill those gaps. Dominic Cull has unfortunately not been able to join us as advertised from ISPA due to some personal issues that he had to deal with, health issues or family issues. And we've also got a substitute from Microsoft that's filling in for another industry person who became unavailable. So we'll sort of update you as we're going along, but I think we're going to start with what we've got because we've got a lot to cover in a very short period of time. We are, of course, discussing the draft data and cloud policy put out earlier this month for comment, or last month for comment, end of last month. For submission, the submission date is still a little unclear because it's given in numbers of days after publication, but it varies between the 12th and the 18th. So we are holding on to the 18th because that suits us better to gather some of the debates on this. So let's hope that's right. Maybe people who are closer to the process who might be joining us can also clarify that. But the idea of this is that increasingly as policy, technology is changing so dynamically, and policy is having to catch up with these changes. The consultation processes and the engagement, not only with the sort of direct interests, but with civil society and non-industry interested players, has become kind of limited in some ways, and some of the issues are just so complex and fast changing that people have not really had a chance to engage with them and understand the implications on them. We've also been looking at data governance as part of our broader work on digital policy, and particularly on issues of digital inequality and ensuring data justice in the area of data governance. So this work, that is why we framed this really in looking at all legislation. A lot of the legislation that's coming through at the moment is kind of, best practice compliant, very informed by European Union regulation that has led some of the kind of pushback against some of the big platforms, global platforms that have, largely operated unregulated, and yet, policy is very context specific, and a lot of those policies may not be suited to the to developing countries, to the institutional endowments or the lack of institutional endowments we may have, and also we've, in this context, obviously it's become far more topical because of the direct human rights dimensions of data and of online content. However, we are, and we're very concerned to work with groups like the African Union Commission, who we have with us here, and of course UNCTAD, who we've worked with over many years on data policy as they've been developing that in their fabulous digital economy reports. And so we're concerned to present an African position, to get debates in Africa going that hold us to some of these international rights standards, but also acknowledge the differences in our environment and avoid the kind of involuntary incorporation that has resulted sometimes from previous international treaties, whether it's on trade or on security or whatever they are. So we're really trying to get greater participation in this, and we very much look forward to the inputs from various of the participants on the panel, but also, of course, the very interesting people we've got in the audience, which we're hoping to gather those questions from. So we're going to start with a short input presentation from Gabriella, just to capture some of the main strands. Already some summaries have come out. I know Priya Chetty's group has put one out. We've had some commentary, Maverick, on concerns around what this data draft policy would mean for privacy and also for ownership of data, and whether governments grabbing control of everything. So we will just give a very high level sort of summary of that, but then go into some of the issues that we think are of concern or important to acknowledge that they're correct and we want to endorse them in the policy So Gabriella will do that for us, and then we'll get some inputs and some responses to that from the other panelists before moving to the audience. So Gabby, could you go ahead?
My name's Gabriella. I'm a senior research fellow with ICT Africa. I've just turned off my camera because I seem to be having some connection issues. So it might just be because no one acknowledged my existence. But I'll be presenting a brief outline on the policy. I come from an open data background, which strongly influences some of my feedback on the paper as well, I think. But I presume everybody's read the policy. I'm going to put on a timer because I've been given very strict instructions about waffling. So I'll outline the policy in brief, just flag some small points, and then move on to issues, particularly the data governance issues, because interestingly, the cloud policy spends quite a lot of energy focusing on some issues on data governance and ownership and localization, which I think is perhaps an interesting approach, but also talk to some of the openness provisions. So within the cloud policy, at the beginning, there's some very important acknowledgements. You know, the big one being that infrastructure is required for us to reach digital benefits. Looking at public investment in digital infrastructures like cloud. Talking about the need to support local innovation communities, which of course is very important in trying to reap benefits from a digital economy. But also talks about public data practices and capacities, which is very important, as well as centrally acknowledging that open data and open systems form part of the benefits that we need to draw, the essential parts of a digital economy. Unfortunately, a lot of this stuff doesn't necessarily find realization in many of the policy recommendations. There is some reflection on the environment, you know, important acknowledgements of both the Protection of Personal Information Act and the Promotion of Access to Information Act, which is, I think, practically very important, given that a lot of the document is meant to be dealing with the public sector's data management, storage, and capacities. It does reflect a lot on the minimum information security standards and the Protection of State Information Act, not Bill, both of which are quite problematic. So misses a directive on security standards, and the Protection of Information Act is a pretty much defunct piece of statute on the protection of state information, which definitely needs a revision, but that is one of the recommendations in the bill. The white paper on ICT is also mentioned. You know, as chief issues identified, it talks about digital inequalities, electricity challenges, inequalities in the distribution of storage facilities, but also that obviously the next wave of technological developments, such as AI and IoT, are very storage heavy. The main recommendations go along digital infrastructure, the points of interest here being the suggestion for special economic zones, so there's not a lot of clarity on what those might introduce, but creating a state digital infrastructure company and a high performance computing and data processing center, largely for the on-demand use by the public sector, for public sector data. Then it turns to access to data and cloud services, talks about how public data needs to be digitalized, promotes a central open data strategy and a central open data portal, doesn't really connect that stuff to existing conversations on open data, which have emerged, say, under the Open Government Partnership or from national treasuries, implementation of certain of these kinds of things, which would be an important connector on a lot of the openness work, but also flags interesting things like data trusts and data banks, and again, revise them as the data protection sections really re-acknowledge Poppy Empire and ask for a revision of the Electronic Communications Act, which I'd be interested to see what they're suggesting there, because I'm not really sure. But there is also talk in there on issues of data residency, which is not the same as data localization, but would have associations to digital taxation, which, you know, when a government is thinking about how to gain benefit from advances in digital economies and digital technologies, taxation is probably one of the areas it should pay its attention to. Then the sections on localization I will get back to. But essentially it says that all critical information infrastructure will be localized. Transfers of data must broadly be in line with POPI, but a copy of all citizen data will be locally stored, which is not consistent really with current data governance practices. It also interestingly claims state ownership of all data generated in South Africa, essentially proposing that it would act as a trustee. While we'll get to that later, I think one of the more fundamental questions is whether the, you know, data, that kind of data governance is really within the remit of the department that has put through this policy. The cybersecurity provisions are essentially just reestablishing, you know, the cybersecurity new frames that are already, processes that are already underway. Oopsie. Then it proposes governance and institutional mechanisms, which include bringing in the DPSA to help develop norms and standards, which is important. I think that's an important role, is to talk about actually internal public sector capacities in the digital economy, which unfortunately doesn't also find strong resonance in the rest of the policy document. The policy document then makes some suggestions on competition, and I'd be very interested to hear our partners' reflections on that and what the role of the DCDT is in that regard. And then it briefly deals with skills development and research and innovation, but unfortunately only deals with those in brief. And considering, I think I will reflect quickly on the real value of data in a digital economy, those two sections where the recommendations are skimmed over are probably the two sections where we need the most energy. To turn to considering the value of data in a digital economy, I think there are some inconsistent discussions on the role that data plays in the space in the policy document that are problematic. In one section, it says that data is the infrastructure for the digital economy, but of course, infrastructure is the infrastructure. Data infrastructure, which is probably what, you know, the majority of the cloud policy should be engaging with, is different from data. We certainly need you know, better data infrastructure, but I think by focusing on data so centrally within the data economy, there is a thing that happens within the document, which starts to focus a lot of the solutions on excludability. So excluding people from data in order to derive benefit from that data, rather than the real benefit of data, which is through its flows and transfers and other utilities. And I say there, you know, the value of both economic and utilitarian value of data is more about processing than storing and holding. So, you know, the classic Ostrom diagram on economic goods would place data is non-rivalrous, and it's partially excludable. It's partially excludable in the sense that, you know, certainly in relation to data sets and databases, rather than data itself, there are forms of excludability which can arise from law through, say, copyright or intellectual property and those kinds of things, but that excludability is partial. But really deriving the value from data is not about ownership. Data forms an essential it's both a byproduct, an essential component to a product. I like to think of it more, especially when you start thinking about real-time data and the process that real-time data plays in creating, you know, more efficient products, more efficient systems. It's more equivalent to the memories of a person than it is to like the engine of a car. Yeah, and part of what this means, that when that's an important part of deriving value, is that there is a lot of energy that should be placed on understanding the capacities of how to analyze that data, process that data, use that data, rather than keep it and own it. As one report says, the relevant economic question of control over data is there more of access and ownership. And yet we have a document that proposes, state ownership of data. There are a couple of questions that this leads to. The first fundamental one being ownership of what? What is the thing we're talking about? They, in their own paper, acknowledge that very little of data is actually used. And most of the data nowadays that we're thinking about that is valuable within a product or a system, say you can think of like even the data that a machine arm is using to help create a vehicle at the Mercedes factory in East London, right? Or that our really fancy Roomba vacuum cleaner is generating as it moves across our apartment. That data is not static. Most of the value of data is that it's real-time data. It is data, but it's also data that's generally quite specific to product. And that's an important issue because a lot of questions on data portability, while important, more and more we're seeing indications that really outside of the specific systems that data is meant to improve, they don't necessarily have a lot of, don't always necessarily have relevance within other systems, within other products. I think we make the mistake in a document like this of thinking of all data, the majority of data as being like personal data about someone's cell phone and name or whatever. And that's the kind of data we're looking at creating value on. And I don't think that that's the case. I think there's some issues with stuff, even just understandings that think about, data being data generated here. When you think about the entire premise of cloud activity, a lot of the data within a system or process is actually being generated at the site of the data center itself. Metadata, all those kinds of things. And then there's the fundamental issue born of the fact that it's not really a thing, that it's not a physical thing, it's incorporeal, but more importantly, it can be used, it's non-rivalrous, so multiple people can use the same kinds of data without conflicting on its value. And I'll flag it here, but it's interesting to think that that's actually why part of the reason why we're having conversation on non-fungible tokens and those kinds of things, because really data is a difficult thing to manage, and how can you claim ownership over something that isn't registered or registrable? And that's really what a non-fungible token is. So those are, I'm already over time, which is killing me. So let me just skim through this. Another question is, on what basis is this position being taken? On what legal basis are we claiming ownership in data? The idea that data can be owned is not one that's actually generally accepted in law or in theory, which is why most rules tend to skirt around the, the issue of data ownership, but talk about data processing. And that focus on data processing is that's because where the actual value is generated. Does it just arise, these rights? Are they like copyright? But then where's the sweat of the brow? All those kinds of classic questions. And they do discuss a little how they want to act as trustees of data. And I've been doing a lot of work on data trusts. I love, the idea of data trust and data stewardship, but one of the fundamental challenges in ideas on data trust is that trusts deal with property. Property means ownership, and how can you claim to own something that cannot be registered and identified as a generic thing, unless it is we make every unit of data a non-fungible token. and then for what purpose? You know, if it's about gaining rights in the data, rights can be gained in objects through a whole lot of other mechanisms, through protection and control that emerges from constitution or statute, but ownership is not required. It doesn't have much to do with its actual economic value. And ownership of data gives real rights to use, enjoy, alienate, and destroy classically, regardless of who is in control of that data. And actually, we see in a digital economy that the value of data is in the control. So I don't think it gets us further. What is the harm? The harm is that even declarations of co-ownership do threaten forms of ownership that can exist. So in data-like contexts. So you can, for instance, have copyright in a data set in a database. And so if the state co-owns part of that set, what does that mean about your ownership rights? Then, of course, you own your own personal data, supposedly. So what does that mean for that? You're all co-owners and your own identity is an interesting idea. But I do think even if we don't believe that the status of this ownership really is a thing, I think it does start to create a perverse incentive to not share and to claim ownership of data in a context where actually we don't talk about data ownership, we talk about data control. And I've just highlighted here some problematic foundations. You know, I think you can see in that section that they talk about the ownership of data by foreign companies, which is not really the situation. Like I said, it's the control, and it recognizes data as a tradable commodity. And certainly data is a tradable commodity, but really that's for a lot of static data. You know, the idea that there's a lot of data brokering, I think, fails to realize that most of the data being shared is even within companies, within products, along those kinds of value chains, because the most value in data is not in its trade, but is in its ability to be processed and perfected within a system. And I think, you know, they talk here again about, you know, that it's being used for advertising purposes on freemium models. I mean, that's Facebook. That's Facebook's business model. That's one business model. You know, the other companies within the top 10 list of profitable capital companies are JP Morgan, Apple, China Construction, Microsoft. All of those companies, data is central to their business, but it has nothing to do with being used for advertising or being a tradable commodity. And again, I think they don't know on which basis the rights on that ownership might come through. I'll quickly go to the localization, and I'm sorry for taking so much time.
Yeah, Gabby, you'll have to really take this a minute, less than a minute.
Yeah,
30 seconds.
Yeah. So there's a section on partial localization. I think there are a lot of issues with that. One of the first one being that the cost of double storage will largely be borne by South African companies. So South African companies who have citizen data will have to transfer it and keep it some here, and presumably keep it in a cloud system that they know gives them the kind of utility they need. Because, you know, I don't necessarily have faith that the centralized national data management center will have the kind of capacities we need, especially in the short term, for engaging with our data frequently in real time and on demand. I think that the idea that it's necessary for law enforcement doesn't have any backing. I don't think we have sufficient cases of where, you know, law enforcement has been hindered by this on a regular basis, that such a significant cost proposal should be in place. And I think it definitely contravenes international best practice on data governance. Openness, there's some great openness provisions on open data. I'm not really sure that it's necessarily the place for them, but I like them. And I'd be interested to hear how they think they should be engaging with the Data Protection Authority, because it's certainly not clear in the policy document. Thank you, sorry.
Thanks very much, Gabby. And I know you wanted to talk a lot more about open data, but hopefully we will get back to that. There are a number of interesting points around the economic value and the imperatives, economic imperatives that government's trying to push with the I suppose controlling of data, or the central role that it's got to play in collecting and disseminating data, which we'll come back to. There's an interesting question from Kimera Chetty. Perhaps if we could now go to Torbjørn Fredrickson. Torbjørn's from UNCTAD. I'm going to ask him to introduce himself briefly, but he's responsible for the Digital Economy Report in his role there. Torbjørn, I wonder, I know you're not going to be able to address this policy specifically, but I'm wondering if you could just comment on, whether you think some of the international good practice touchstones have been touched, and particularly, whether you think the government position on the need to, control data and data sovereignty and various things actually fulfills the requirement of, promoting data for economic use, the economic imperatives, but also the protection of individuals. And particularly in relation to the cloud and the earlier cloud studies that you've done, that demonstrated that very often with the lack of digital infrastructure, cloud services are often more secure in terms of data protection than local government agencies can provide. And I know the Government Information Technology Officers Group, GITA, in this country several years ago was pushing CETA for being able to move their services to the cloud, which the security cluster basically was not permitting the implementation of at that time, on the grounds that they had far many more breaches as people were using Google or whatever email anyway, because their services were down. So I'm just wondering if you could just give us a kind of international perspective to how this aligns, or broadly what the good practice principles are that we should be putting forward.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you for inviting me to this webinar. I think one should start by welcoming at least an effort by the government of South Africa to try to come up with a cloud and data policy, which is becoming increasingly important as the digital economy evolves. So I think it's a good effort, but of course it's extremely difficult. And when we're looking for global best practices in this area, there are not that many that you can immediately identify this is the way to go. So I think you also asked me to consider, the differences between countries at different levels of development. So now I'll reflect upon that a little bit. First, I think it recognizes, of course, the rapid growth of data in the digital economy, and this is affecting all our countries, something that has been accentuated by COVID. We rely increasingly on digital solutions, which is generating a lot of data. And we also see that data has become increasingly central to value creation in the digital economy, which is correctly reflected in the paper. I think one could perhaps stress even more the point that raw data as such carries very little value, and that it's not just once the raw data is transformed into or processes anyway, has to be processed in a way that can generate some kind of digital intelligence that can be monetized in different ways, as was mentioned by Gabriela. So again, therefore, control over data has become increasingly strategically important, and it is vital for emerging digital technologies from AI, blockchains, etc. And moreover, in virtually every value chain, not just in the narrow vertical of ICTs, but in automotive, agriculture, whatever, the ability to collect, store, analyze, and transform data brings power and competitive advantages. And as has been mentioned, digital platforms are, of course, particularly well positioned in this context. But it's not just the digital platforms, it's also the lead corporations in most value chains, which you could talk about digital platforms as well, but not the ones that we normally think about. So then the question, what should a good policy on data look like? It's a great question. It's a terribly difficult one to answer. I think what complicates the matter is that the leading powers of the world are going in very different directions in dealing with data and data flows. And I think the different approaches vary depending on various factors, such as their position in the global data value chain. So we have most digital platforms based in the US and China, which makes these players take a certain stance, whereas the European Union, which is another big player, they're relatively weak, like most developing countries are in the data value chain. So they take a more of a defensive approach, looking really out to protect the interests of the data generators in the EU. It's a question also of the general readiness in the country, what you would call the data and digital infrastructure to harness data for social as well as private value generation. And there are also then naturally different government priorities here to promote economic development, protect human rights, national security, digital sovereignty, enable the government to undertake surveillance activities, law enforcement, etc. And I think this is the crux of the matter, this multidimensional nature of data that makes it so difficult to address in one policy. And that is also, I think, some of the questions that Gabriella raised. What is the remit of this particular part of the government? Whatever the remit of that department is, it will require a lot of interaction with other parts of the government to really come up with a balanced approach. And another factor to keep in mind here, also from the value creation perspective, is the network and scale effects involved. So just collecting a little bit of data, you can do so much with. But if you have data from the whole world, like ways Facebook and Google have, you can do completely different things, and you have also ways to monetize the data thanks to your big networks. So just a few issues that I think should be part of this kind of policy, and I think most of them are reflected. One thing that I think could be elaborated a little bit more is what types of data are in focus for this policy, to have clear distinction between the personal, non-personal, private, public, government, so on. Secondly, how to assign ownership, or I would also prefer control over the data, how to build consumer trust and protect data privacy, how to regulate the data flow issues, and how to build the appropriate capabilities for harnessing digital data for development. Now, many of these things are in the report, but let me pick up on a few of these. A key question on this data ownership is who should be able to control personal data? Is this the individuals that are generating the personal data? Is it the platforms that collect the data? Is it the governments in the country where the individual or where the platforms reside, and so on and so forth? This is not really clear. And of course, claiming that all data generated in one country is the ownership of that country, I think this is complicated, complex, because the whole notion of ownership is difficult in the case of data. Data protection and privacy. Well, globally right now, the UN Special Rapporteur on the right of privacy has encouraged all UN member states as an interim measure towards developing more global harmonized approaches to privacy, to ratify Data Protection Convention 108 plus of the Council of Europe. Currently, 6 African countries have signed up to the Council of Europe 108 Convention. Only half of African countries have data protection laws in place to start with. So I think this is something that could be considered if it would be relevant also for South Africa. On the data flow issue, it's a balancing act. You want to be able to adopt national restrictions on data flows to achieve legitimate public objectives, but you don't want to do that in a way that harms the proper functioning of the internet, or that adds tremendous extra costs for the small or larger businesses that are involved, not least the domestic firms. As I said, there's no consensus on how best to regulate data flows. A little progress in terms of harmonization at regional and international levels has been made, including, of course, in Africa. Views diverge widely with regard to what substantive issues that might be the most appropriate to discuss for harmonization, and also what forum should such discussion take place in. But I think it would be useful if South Africa, even in its national policy, reflects on what role it should play also in international context, because many of the issues that need to be addressed cannot be addressed only at the national level. So what is the thinking of the government in that area? And finally, it has a good discussion on the need for relevant skills and infrastructure, but I think it is important also to recognize that just having skills is not enough. You need to have kind of an ecosystem where you have the businesses, the academic centers, and so on that can contribute to engage in data science, big analytics, and so on. And this is not easy. In fact, this is one perhaps of the biggest digital divides right now, access to such skills. And even in the more advanced economies, much of the best skills tend to end up in the biggest firms that can pay well, and which creates a challenge for governments actually to handle this thing. And I think it's good that it touches upon some what I would call flanking policy areas that are not pure data policies, but competition policy, education policy, taxation policies, trade policies, and infrastructure policies. I think they have a place there, but probably not all of them can be regulated under this part of the government. So while there is a clear need for policies to be tailored here in the country context, and you need flexibility for that, it should recognize that it also needs to work with other countries to find out what the best way to move forward. I'm sure I didn't answer half of what you asked me to do, but that was my contribution. Thank you.
I was also asking you to answer this impossible question in a few minutes. So thank you very much for doing that. Yeah, Torbjørn, I mean, there's so much to take away from what you said, but I think, you know, what really sort of comes out from what you said is, you know, the commitment that South Africa's got, and probably being a primary beneficiary to the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, and the tensions with positions both on sovereignty and on localization and control of data that would not support the kind of data flows that we're going to require for the free trade area to function effectively. And of course, the kind of digital readiness that stands behind that. But just, you know, on the data protection side, of course, that's also another enabling factor for the success of the Continental Free Trade Agreement and the free flow of the flow of information, data flows that accompany that. And I think in this legislation there is recognition of the Protection of Private Information Act and the Information Regulator, which has finally come into force after so long. And I think on that note, I'm going to ask Jonathan Claren from WISER, but Jonathan, please do give us a little bit more background about what you are working on and doing very briefly before you start. And perhaps, Jonathan, you know, just speak more generally about it, but I would also like you, if you wouldn't mind, to really kind of spend a little bit of time on some of the human rights aspects of this, and particularly our topic of, you know, perhaps we are compliant with some of the practices that Torbjørn's reflected, but are these actually going to redress digital inequality? Are they likely to support, you know, go beyond compliance and actually support data justice?
Thank you very much, Alison, and thanks to Research ICT Africa. I'm glad that this policy and then this webinar gives us a chance to discuss these kinds of questions. I want to make remarks that are in three, a little bit about policy, a little bit about regulation, and a little bit about rights. And I think it's probably fair to say, Alison, I'll only be giving a little bit of an answer to the question you did ask. And I do want to mention that I'll be dropping off at 2 or shortly thereafter in order to go teach. And I'm sorry I won't be able to stick around longer. In relation to the policy part, I think it seems to me that this policy is one of those policies that really raises questions more than it gives answers. And by that, I don't want to say that it doesn't have value as policy, but I think it's fundamentally more derivative. It seems like it's a mapping, it's a trying to assess what is currently out there. Yes, it says that it's setting policy for what would be regulation and rights, et cetera, implementation going forward. But as Torben and Gabriela and you, Alison, have also mentioned, the topic is so huge that a 40-page policy, can't do that. So, and in terms of the actors that it's in touch with, it seemed as if the State Security Agency and then the Communications Ministry were clearly here. But even though the framing of it is very much economic, right? Fourth Industrial Revolution, digital economy, et cetera, there didn't appear to be, there is acknowledgement of the competition issues, but I don't think there's actually real engagement there. So in some sense, it could even be seen as overambitious, or by continuing with ambitions that, we need more coordination and more discussion about. But I think at the same time that I say those things, which, are a bit negative, I think we should really recognize the value of having a policy, of the mapping, and enabling the sorts of discussions and commenting that are happening here. Okay, so that's policy. Regulation. I wanted to speak about, and it really comes from the development of UNCTAD's next digital economy report, a process that I was able, through Research ICT Africa, to have a little bit of an insight to. But I wanted to know, reading this policy, where in terms of localization, South Africa was going. And I've just said that I don't think this policy is actually giving answers so much as posing questions, but still, I think it's interesting to read to try and see what is there. Yeah, that report, which is still under development, as I understand it, is saying there's a whole spectrum, right, between kind of free market US approaches and maybe on the other side, Chinese development and national security approaches. Somewhere in the middle were hard conditions on transfer of data in terms of data localization. I guess I saw that there were several parts to the policy, a reference to critical data infrastructures, and other parts that seem very clearly to be welcoming data localization. So Alison, I think I agree with the implication you were just drawing when you were commenting on Torben's about there's really a protectionist element, I think, effectively. And we don't have the UNCTAD digital economy report in front of us, but in those terms, I wonder if the kind of data localization policy that's imminent here, implicit here, is really one of partial localization, frankly, rather, and moving towards there, rather than the more kind of middle of the road approach. In this respect, I think it might be interesting to note that the policy document that this one brought most to my mind was a recent one from Kenya by the Kenyan telecommunications industry, purporting to be on behalf of all government, but also very much influenced by Fourth Industrial Revolution thinking, and possibly in the Kenyan context where the telecommunications ministry is actually, with Safaricom, et cetera, been, arguably more of a dominant player in kind of that regulatory universe than the communications regulator, ministry and department is here, because as we've noticed, there is a strong competition authority here. There is one in Kenya too, but not quite as strong. And we do have the information regulator and PAPIA out now. Yeah, and well, I'll come back to this at the end. The last part, I wanted to speak a little bit about rights. So I was also reading the policy very closely, And Alison, you asked what some of my research has been on recently. It's been more, I guess I've gotten a little bit further away from human rights and a little bit more towards competition and so on, which maybe is socioeconomic rights, right? Anyhow, so I was interested to see what the policy was doing on the right to data portability. And you had to kind of search to find it there. And looking into where the global debate on data portability is, I really think it's at the intersection of these two kind of policy areas of data protection on the one side and competition policy on the other. And we're having some, well, there's some debates about really which of those policies, those understandings would be most appropriate to look at the right of data portability, which is the idea that a person or a consumer or a data subject, it's all in the labeling there, would be able to take and transfer, access, take, transfer data with them. So yeah, there really isn't much talk here. I'm in favor of a strong right of data portability, and I would have wanted this policy to speak more to that. To continue with the rights theme, I think that speaks to a few other things. One is, and Gabby's very interesting, Ostrom influence production kind of depiction of where data fits in the value chain. You know, there really isn't, there isn't much attention here. Well, there isn't any attention, I don't think, to industrial policy. So, for instance, the work of CRED and the Industrial Development Think Tank and where data and the digital economy can fit into the productive value chains, you know, has not been, that work has not been accessed here. There is a call for a review of competition policy, but no engagement, or I think actually, if I'm reading it right, acknowledgement of the recent market inquiry or the very recent revision of competition legislation. I can't imagine anything's going to be redone in any serious way, you know, at least for a couple of years in that what Torben refers to as a flanking area. Okay, the last 2 points I'd like to make on rights were, one is about our old friend, the Secrecy No Longer Bill, but the Protection of State Information Act. And it was, yes, Gabby, that was a reference. There you are, smiling, good. Yeah, this is, well, is this the policy space for that piece of legislation? I've actually not tracked that so much in the last 6 months, but my understanding is that the president in middle of last year actually referred that back to Parliament, which I think there at least needs to be a question about whether that is a constitutional option for that piece of very much rights relevant legislation to go back or not. This policy seems to say it is back appropriately in Parliament and you know, can be revised or whatever. And I think that raises issues about how long we're going to keep going with the 1982 Protection of Information Act, which is definitely a rights regarding, well, not a rights regarding, but a rights relevant statute. The last point is, Alison, you asked me to speak about inequality. I've noticed one of my colleagues at WITS, Alexander Beafeld, is there speaking, and he's been doing research on the relevance of inequality between states. And I think, yeah, I'd agree with Torben there that, you know, I think there really probably was a chance here in this policy to reflect more on, yeah, particularly cross-border data flows. I've read that section several times, but really to understand more the, you know, less the domestic focus and actually a bit more of the transnational context would have really helped here, even with issues like inequality that are, you know, clearly pressing in South Africa. I think I'll end there. Thank you. And that was an invitation to Alex to come in the conversation.
Thanks, Jonathan. I was going to ask Alex if he did want to come in briefly. I was just going to ask if our other panelists, particularly Sohila, who is going to be on next from the African Union Commission, would indulge us and let us just get any questions for you, or maybe just only one, Henri, that anybody has before you leave us. So Henri, is there an obvious question for Jonathan, or would somebody from the audience like to indicate or that they have a question? Or of the other panelists who want to ask Jonathan a particular question before he leaves, because that was going to be our next round.
Thanks, Alison. There was actually a question for Jonathan, which came from, I think, Andrew. So Andrew, do you just want to ask that question directly?
Yeah, basically it was the implications for universities of the open research data. And this seems problematically caught up in South Africa's own version of Bayh-Dole, the intellectual property rights from publicly funded universities legislation. As I understand the Act, it regards data as IP because it can be protected somewhere in the world. So a database is protectable in Europe, and thus the Act tries to bring European law into South Africa and then requires a university to seek protection. And you can't disclose this. So this seems at complete odds with the idea of open data, with the remainder of science and innovation's thrust towards building a kind of open data. Is this just somebody didn't realize that policy is still on the books and it's hindering? Is there perhaps tension within science and innovation between those who want to sort of extract every cent they can and those who want to sort of drive innovation? Any ideas?
Before Jonathan responds, I just want to tag on another question. I think it's broadly covered, but it has a slightly different focus from Laura Chenoweth from UCT, who said her interest is with the implications for higher education in terms of, one, the data implications for universities with regard to students, and then data for research, and then thirdly, university cloud services. And you know, I think we might get Laura when we've got time at the end to speak a little bit about this, because a lot of her work has been looking at some of the issues around the commercialization and commodification of education, and some of the implications of this for data are obviously significant. But Jonathan, if you could just quickly respond to those before we move on to Sohila.
Okay, well, it sounds to me like both of the people who have posed those questions know more about them than I do. Which kind of goes back to that first point about the value of this policy is to identify issues, but I don't actually see so many answers, kind of well worked through answers, whether you agree with them or not, here in this policy. But Andrew, I think it's relevant for both to speak about the higher education and openness. I think there is a kind of, I certainly support open data and open access, but it's like with transparency, there's actually quite a bit of ambiguity there. So I think Andrew's point about the possibility of, different policy advocates within different parts of maybe even the same ministry is apt, because that act requiring commercialization and protection at the same time as speaking to the access to public knowledge. And we're not even talking about its implementation, which I guess I really think is what we need to look into, to actually ask, is the rights discourse and is the, this is ownership, or these are intellectual property rights that must be protected by higher education institutions and can be commercially valuable. Speaking at WITS, I think, I've been part of, broadly part of those discussions, and I think we've had one, maybe two commercially relevant, sort of spin-offs. So I think it really is an open question. And I think that means that some of the different understandings of what transparency and openness might be there would actually be better to look into. But that's going to require a deeper dive. That's going to require, case study implementation along those lines, as well as answers from Andrew and Laura.
Sorry, I'm on mute there. Jonathan, I'm just going to thank you very much. And we will pick this up at the end. I'm going to put Alex and Laura and Andrew on hold for the moment, just so that we can get our input from Suhaila. And then we also have Andrea Campbell, who's replacing Sia from Microsoft. So we've still got a few rounds, but then we'll come back and get another round from the panel. But thank you very much, Jonathan. I suppose we should have let you go off and do your day job. Thank you.
Bye.
So thank you. So the next we have Suhaila Amazou from the Information Society Division at the African Union Commission, who's been working on data policy. But we're really asking you, Suhaila, to share your feelings on the cloud policy, or the importance of cloud policy, not necessarily this policy specifically, in terms of the digital transformation strategy of the African Union Commission, which we know data policy and cloud policy is a very critical part of. Thank you.
Thank you for extending the invitation to the African Union Commission to participate in such meeting, because what is happening at national level, it should be like we should be like involved and be aware, because it's what is happening at national level that will be brought to the continental level. With regard to the digital transformation strategy, as you mentioned, it was adopted in February 2020 by the AU Summit, and it aims to be like the coordinated approach toward digital transformation of the continent. It aims to be comprehensive, inclusive, transformative, and also innovative, since we look forward to harness the potential of digital technologies to solve some of our development challenges across the continent. And really, we try to align the digital transformation strategy with the global agenda of the African Union, namely the Agenda 2063. And we really look forward to use that digital transformation, or this digital revolution, like to improve or to modernize some of key sectors of our economy. Digital transformation is made of 3 layers. We have enabling we can say founding pillars. We have the enabling environment, we have entrepreneurship, we have infrastructure or digital connectivity, and we have the digital skills or capacity. We have cross sectors, where we identified the main sectors that we will focus on within the 10 years, because the digital transformation is 2020-2030. And we have cross-cutting teams where we have data protection, and also we have emerging technologies and digital ID. But as we may notice, that everything relates on data. So data is important. It is highlighted within the strategy as one of the cross-cutting issue. And also in 2019, during our ministerial meeting, we have been tasked by our ministers of ICT and telecommunication to work with member states and all regional organizations and all stakeholders to develop continental data policy framework. And we have started working on it. And if one of the speakers mentioned that developing a national data policy is challenging, I think continental one is even more challenging. So this meeting is really important for us, since it helped us to see all these challenges. The objective of this data policy, as we see it, is like to put data at the center of the socio-economic development. And also we aim to support the data-driven economy, because as we are aware of, a huge amount of data is generated by our citizens, by governments, by industries across the continent, but they are not efficiently used. Sometimes it is even transferred outside the continent, and we are not aware how this data are used. and we challenge to protect the privacy of African citizens, since, as it was mentioned, only 28 countries, they have in place the data protection frameworks and institutions, but half of the continent are in the process of developing their national data protection frameworks. But this data policy, we are in the phase of shaping this data policy framework, and we aim to address different aspects, all what has been mentioned, like especially like the data governance, because we need the continental data governance mechanism and framework to enable the data flows, to create space or a data ecosystem to make data available for development of industries, research, and also this data analytics to enable policy, like we say, evidence-based policies and all these things. But we are in the process of shaping all this. But when we will get something that we can present, we'll also go with, to present it to the member states, because they are the first, our in French we say interlocuteur, that we work most with member states, but also with all stakeholders and regional organizations to further discuss it and to see really how we can achieve this continental data policy framework. We aim to address different aspects, as I mentioned, with data governance, but also the personal data and also data security, the data capabilities, as we know that we really need to develop these data skills or digital skills in order to enable our citizens to really take advantage of this digital transformation. And also we try to address the data infrastructure, but from the way we see it on our side is data infrastructure is all what related to data centers. And within this, we will address also the cloud policy. But because I want just to conclude, I want just to say that things are improving, although the level of data centers in Africa is still low comparing to other regions, but there is progress, because the last time when we finalized the list of the projects within the program policy, we call it PIDA, is the continental framework for the infrastructure development in Africa. The number of ICT projects has increased, and many regions, they have proposed the data centers. And I think this one is a big progress, and I think I can leave it there. I will come back if need be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Suhaila. I wanted to just move on to Andrea because of time, but obviously the digital transformation strategy of the AUC provides a very important continental context, especially for some of these larger companies that are working, across the continent and globally. We felt that input from one of these big data players would be important. I'm just trying to confirm that Andrea Campbell is online, who was going to join us from Microsoft. Oh, so sorry, I see a message here that's sent to me directly that I missed way back, or not so far back, but she's having, she's going to drop off and find a better signal and rejoin. So let's carry on, and hopefully she'll join us before we finish off. Henri, this seems like a good time to get some of those questions for the different participants. And also, because there's such a short time, I haven't given participants, as I told them in the discussion notes on this, that they would get a chance now to respond to each other. So please also take this opportunity to respond to each other. But let's get some of these fantastic questions that seem to have come up in the chat. Henri.
Thanks, Alison. I'm actually going to go directly to Chimera. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, because she had a great question in the chat that I was unsure about, and she said she's happy to speak and ask it herself. Chimera, can we come to you?
Sure. Thanks, Henri, and thanks for organizing this great event. The question maybe is a simple one. Anyone is free to answer. The objectives of the policy, I think, are incredibly uncontentious insofar as they speak to socio-economic or just broadly macroeconomic imperatives. But Prof. Claren touched on this a little bit. The relationship between the objectives of the policy and the proposed implementation and specifically aligning to preparedness, institutional capacity, and also regulatory or policy harmonization, not just domestically, but even just thinking about the developments at the AFTA level. We've got the protocol for e-commerce and how that relates to cross-border data flows. You've got a policy that is both speaking in protectionist language when it comes to things like localization, but also saying we need this policy in order to compete globally in the digital economy. I'm just interested in that, whether those are like contradictions that we find at an ideological level, but also at the policy level or regulatory level, what we think the state of South Africa's readiness is at the institutional level or at the legal level are things that, like Prof. Clarence said, raised more questions, and whether the panel feels that the policy seeks to sufficiently answer that, or maybe we'll find out as we see more laws come into place. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Camira. I wonder if we should take 3 questions and then go to the panelists. I'm going to take 2 more. The next one is Nathan Ross, who has a couple of questions around AI. Nathan.
Hi, everyone. Yes, so my interest is from an AI perspective, and I guess it comes from the fact that although this policy deals with data specifically, I don't believe it goes in enough detail with the impact of data within specific technologies. And maybe that's because it's a sort of run to market approach with the policy. But my question is really what the impact of ownership of data will have on the data that actually informs AI, and then the data that AI may produce, and then the different information security standards that the government will employ for itself, but also the businesses that it engages with, or that the policy itself engages with. And then the last point is about investment within the South African economy. I think a balance needs to be struck between competition elements as well as the need for regulation. So my concern is whether that's actually been thought about and whether enough stakeholders were actually engaged throughout the development of the policy.
Thanks, Nathan Ross. Can I just say that I think you certainly win the prize for the most appropriate backdrop today. But before we address your questions, can we please go to Kito, who also has a couple of questions around the societal impact and value of data, and then we'll go back to the panelists for answers. Thank you.
My question is, I think Nathan spoke briefly about my question, which is just the involvement of different stakeholders in the formulation of this policy. Now that it's there, I just want to hear, the different, maybe from, the different panelists on how different industries intersecting with data and people who have expertise in inequality, exclusion, discrimination can contribute to this policy, and maybe like advice in form of through this consultation, how going forward this African government can bring in these different perspectives in coming up with a policy that does not exacerbate inequality.
Thanks. I think we'll just kind of run from the beginning again, if that's okay. I don't see Andrea online. She is not even connecting to me now that she's offline. So I would somebody else could keep an eye on her and just alert me to that. Joining us. Torbjørn, would you like to tackle a couple of those questions? We've not got a lot of time left, so maybe you don't want to tackle all of them, but a few of them, or skim over the top of all 3.
Well, I mean, some of them are very specific to the South African context that I'm not really the expert to respond to. Maybe Gabriella will be better equipped to respond to those. But I mean, it's clear that, as I mentioned, the challenge of data policies is their multidimensionality and the fact that they are so cross-cutting. They affect so many aspects of economies and societies. And of course, I have very little knowledge about how this policy has been developed in South Africa, but presumably there has been interaction between the relevant parts of the government, because at one stage that will kick in. So I think it's very important from the beginning of formulating this policy that you have this interaction with like a whole of government approach from the Minister of Justice to trade and ICT and economic development and what have you. Then that is only at the governmental level, of course. And then the multi-stakeholder aspect here is really critical if you want to give adequate attention to the rights dimension, to the economic development dimension, to the security dimension, and so on and so forth. I suppose this exercise that is ongoing right now is partly trying to address this need to let everyone have a chance to give feedback on this. But I don't know if there is also a more systematic approach to engage with the relevant stakeholder groups in South Africa. I would encourage that. It would be a good thing, I think. On the competition policy, I'll just touch upon that. One of the challenges that we see here, I think the policy alludes a lot to the role of the big global digital platforms here in the data economy, which is absolutely correct. The challenge that the competition authorities are facing here is that these platforms are not resident of those economies. So the challenge is to find a way to address the activities of an entity that is delivering all of its services digitally. And it's a question of jurisdiction here. One aspect that has been flagged, for instance, in the competition authority or in the competition law of Germany is to give more attention to the role of data. For instance, if there is a merger of two enterprises, you don't just look at that impact on the market reach, but also on the impact of the control of data that could be relevant for market development, economic development. I know that the South African Competition Authority has been very active in this debate, you know, UNCTAD has a lot of work related to competition policy in the digital economy as well. And I think this again points to the need to combine what you do at the national level with efforts at the international level or at the continental African level to really find new ways forward in this area. It's not easy, but it's very important that the government tries to explore where are the opportunities and the barriers to actually reach the objectives that you want to reach. And of course, then it comes back to the question of enforcement as well, which has been mentioned by other panelists, which is another challenge both in data protection and competition policies and so on and so forth. I'll close with that. Thank you.
Thank you. Sohila, I'm wondering if you want to come in on any of those questions?
Maybe I will try to respond on the question related to the impact of data on artificial intelligence. They say that the impact of data ownership. I think it is clear that for machine learning, especially that the softwares and also the artificial intelligence systems depends on the quality of data. And I think for us, as I mentioned, if we manage to come up with a continental policy or one standard or uniform system to process our data, also to own our data, because as I mentioned, so far most of African countries, they don't own their own data. So I think this kind of common policies or common approach towards the use and also data processing, and also it will enable us to manage our data. I think it will have direct impact on artificial intelligence and also in research in general, because as we mentioned, data analytics will affect all sectors. So I think more we own or we manage or we control the quality of our data, more we can get access to this data-driven technologies or data-driven economies. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Sohila. Nathan, I also, you know, I wanted to kind of concur that obviously, you know, data is a kind of, you know, critical input for artificial intelligence, and just to flag that the global platform on artificial intelligence that's been established by OECD and UNESCO has got a special data governance working group, which we actually working on and trying to provide somewhat of an African perspective to. particularly in regard to the issues of data justice and the issues that of data governance, particularly in relation to AI. So, looking at the problems with data sets in terms of, invisibility, of representation, of bias and those kinds of things on which, commercial and public decision-making is increasingly being based. So I agree with you that there are, particular aspects, while this policy is obviously trying to inform data governance more generally, it might require additional, or particular focuses in order to deal with some of the policy challenges there. As I said, mainly around the kind of, absence of big quantities of data in order to, accurately inform the kind of decision making that it's being used for, commercial and publicly. Gabriella, would you like to come in on some of those questions?
Sure, I'll try and a couple of them sort of overlap, or at least they do in my head. So, I mean, because I think one of the things, Kito's talking about inequalities, and Camilla, there's a lot of, I think there are quite a few contradictions in a lot of different components. And part of my instinctive response to that is, I think that, for something that's meant to be a cloud policy and dealing with cloud and dealing with data infrastructure, it spends a lot of time dealing just with data. And I think data, and a lot of those data questions are a much later data question. I think there is a need to still deal with some very fundamental internet infrastructure questions that the policy happily just, skims over as if that's sorted out, and talks about special economic zones, and which are largely based in cities. And part of the reason is because of digital infrastructure. And, cloud forms part of the data infrastructure that will be necessary to really gain dividends from the new kinds of technologies, our AI and our IoT. But then it spends a lot of attention on a static understanding of data that I don't think gets us anywhere, and then skims over capacities. When I started reading the document, it was talking about public sector, providing a facility for public sector data. I mean, I think that could work. You know what I mean? Is it necessary? I don't know. That's another question. But that's great to start trying. But the fact that it spends it only cursorily deals with digital skills, only cursorily deals with, public sector capacity to manage these technologies, develop these technologies, and doesn't pay significant amounts of attention to investment into public sector research and development. I think it seems to have skipped over again, just like we've been skipping over for the last 15, 20 years, issues of digital infrastructure and data infrastructure for substantive issues that are like to be a further question down the road. I don't think we even get to a lot of these questions yet, given our capacities. I think that's a wasted opportunity. And I think then unwittingly might suffocate a lot of the local attempts to innovate, which are coming up organically in spite of these infrastructure challenges. That's my big concern, I think. In terms of the stakeholders that were engaged, I mean, it's got that interesting thing on the advisory council, a data advisory council, but I don't, again, know what role that is. A lot of the stuff on data seems to have come about with, as much as we mentioned POPI, doesn't deal with the data regulator as a system, as a person. And I think this policy does show a very centralized national government role, because it's a national government policy, so I get that, but doesn't seem to have engaged with the regulators. And meanwhile, the regulators are really going to be the forefront, at least in all these conversations elsewhere, are at the forefront of trying to find the balances, the nuanced balances in economic intervention versus substantive rights and stuff that are already happening. I mean, the Competition Commission just issued an urgent interdict against Facebook and WhatsApp. We reflect on that case a little in the AI4D research paper that we've got coming out soon, so people can keep an eye on RIA's website for that. So our competition commission is actually already engaging with these issues. And I think that the stuff that Torben said and that Jonathan said early on was really relevant, you know, for something that's claiming to lay a stake in the ground in the digital economy. It seems to think the digital economy is completely domestic. And that's a big flaw, you know, to not, that's a glaring gap. So, but I sound exasperated. I am. But, you know, I like the beginning of it a lot. I love the stuff on open data and open standards and creating standards, and that comes a lot to the stuff we're talking about in AI, but also in terms of quality of data, creating standards for data that allows it to be good data, you know. But I still don't think that should have actually been dealt with under this policy. I think we've dealt with other issues. Yeah, and I think the Competition Commission, like Ian's saying, the Competition Commission case is really interesting because, you know, it shows a very South African and African focus on competition, which place public interest first. You know, what their eventual decision will be is different, and I'm not, you know, I'm not going to make judgments on what the ultimate decision should be in the context. But I think that, you know, the prioritizing public interest so much in a competition inquiry was really interesting. Thank you.
Abby, thank you for that. We're rapidly running out of time, but we've got a whole lot of great questions. So perhaps we'll put those somewhere where people can respond to them as we proceed towards making some sort of submission. A number of people have indicated a desire to kind of join us on a submission or to, you know, cross-reference submissions or things like that. We don't really have an opportunity now to go into that too much. But if anybody does want to, as I said, join us in this or make a comment or something, we will try and circulate an early draft of this, but depending on these shifting time spans, we might not get a lot of opportunity to really canvass, you know, input to make it representative of this group. And we certainly won't make it representative of this seminar at all. So you're not kind of just by you know, if it linked by affiliation. So I think we've covered a lot of important areas. I see that finally Andrea's in, and I might just give her 2 minutes if people don't mind holding on. Let's see. Andrea, are you there?
Hi, Doctor. Yes, apologies about earlier connectivity.
I'm so sorry. I'm about to wrap up, but would you like to take 1 or 2 minutes and just give us a you know, big global companies perspective on this? And of course, you're South African based as well, and this policy is very pertinent to you and how you're going to operate. So perhaps you could just give us a quick input, if you wouldn't mind, without having been able to follow the various other discussions.
Yeah, sure. So with regards to us as a multinational, the policy we feel is key. Some interesting points that we've actually seen and that we would like to comment on and take up further is the points regarding custodianship of data and the distinct difference between the fact that government will be trustee of all government data, and also the need that some stakeholders, especially those in government, feel that government should be actually the owner of data, and we need to draw a distinction between that. Also, we'd want to understand better how all the key stakeholders, such as State Security Agency, CETA, and all the other SOEs would go about resuming responsibilities which are actually created within the Act, and the timelines with regards to that, because that has a big impact on how we as multinationals actually operate and our ability to conduct business in South Africa. There's mixed feelings for us about the draft policy, as we feel there might be some limitations for us, especially around the fact that we'd have to keep a copy of all data that leaves South Africa, that would create data center and capacity issues for us. Also, with regards to the fact that there's a lot of pieces that are included in the policy, like cybersecurity, the data, like the retention of information that leaves the country as well. We want to understand how this would relate to POPI. The piece on cybersecurity, it doesn't really reference the act. We feel there's a disconnect there, like they need to speak to each other. PIA becomes very relevant as well, but there's certain pieces that we feel need to be elaborated on, like Internet of Things, etc. And I know we're working towards sort of getting some kind of consultative session with them prior to commentary either closing or post commentary closing, and then perhaps opening it up again where we can get further clarity on some of these points which would affect us directly, and which means we'd have to perhaps alter business models and the way we do business and our processes internally as well.
Thank you, Andrea. There are obviously very significant implications for you. I think from a commercial point of view, those are clear. I think there's also significant implications from a non-commercial point of view that are really sort of significant omissions in the document as well. I'm just going to sort of distance myself a little bit from we shouldn't include open data policy in here, just because we've been struggling to get it in so long. We actually had it in the broadband policy for SA Connect, and it was struck out by government because it wasn't officially it wasn't official policy yet, despite South Africa at that time heading the Open Government Data International Forum, what it was called. So I suppose we'll be a little bit pragmatic about what should go in and what shouldn't go in. I just want to make the point, however, that we very often our lack of implementation, our poor policy outcomes or our poor implementation outcomes are ascribed to the lack of implementation. We've got great policy, but actually, it's not implemented well. And I just want to flag again that, it's not great policy if we don't have the capacity to implement it. And so a lot of the positive things, the arguments that there needs to be, greater control of data for economic development and for strategic, as strategic assets for economic development are important. But if the state doesn't actually have the capacity, if we don't have the institutional capacity to implement those, and as I said, the lack of state capacity in certain areas around security might be a positive thing, but so it actually won't get implemented even if it's there. But I don't think we want to do policy on that basis. We want to have good principled policy as possible, but recognizing our institutional constraints or our political economic conditions that restrain us from necessarily having the Rolls Royce on all this stuff. So I think we've got an interesting discussion internally even before we make our submission, and we certainly look forward to engaging those of you who have already indicated a desire to engage with us on our submission, and or join us on our submission, or just simply review or comment. So we will make our best effort to get something in advance, but I think just to alert everybody, it's going to be a bit of a scramble towards the end. We will try and give you, a day in which to look at stuff for those of you who indicate that you would like to do that. I am just going to quickly scan, because I haven't been looking at the chat in the last little bit, whether, Henri, is there anything else we need to say or do, because we're 4 minutes over?
I think there's a lot more we need to say and do, but we probably need another 3 hours. So I think, thank you. There are a lot of useful comments in the chat that we will try and incorporate in our submission as well, as far as is reasonable. But nothing that's pressing. Just around the date, Janita kindly said that the date that they've gotten from the department is the 18th of May, but they have asked for an extension. It would be great if you would publicize that extension if it does come available. Thank you.
Yeah, they might make it on an individual basis. Andrew has also written to the department trying to get confirmation, and we will share that with the same list when we get it. Thank you all to all of you, especially to our panelists who've scrambled together at quite short notice onto this webinar. and to all of you who've participated in such a fantastic way in our chat and in the questions online. Thank you so much. Take care. And hopefully we'll all be vaccinated soon and can meet in person.